Welcome to this edition of Free Speak, a podcast of the Namibia Media Trust, and I'm Gwen Lister.
And very nicely, our constitution say that whenever a right is limited, it should not negate the essential content of the right.
We're here today to talk a little bit about our Minister of ICT, who recently made the statement that Cabinet had decided that they're going to look at ways and means of regulating social media, mainly because of concern for teen pregnancies and to mitigate this. Now, that's caused quite a controversy on the online media and elsewhere. Seen along with our police chief's threat to deal with what he called radical youth who insult elders and leaders, these are ominous signs. With me to discuss these and other issues are John Nakuta, media ombudsman and human rights lawyer, who feels that
this is a smokescreen to regulate what they always wanted to do.
Also, Admire Mare, an extensively published academic lecturing at NUST, who has a particular interest in ethics and social media.
Of course, maybe it's just an excuse that they are using to justify the need to regulate social media. So for me, that raises alarm, and also it's got a chilling effect in terms of freedom of expression and also internet freedom in general.
Media and journalism is often the preferred target of the authorities, but of late, verbal attacks are being directed towards ordinary Namibians exercising their rights to free expression on Facebook, Twitter, and WhatsApp, among others. Welcome, John and Admire. Can I get from you both your initial thoughts? Perhaps let's start with you, Admire, about what the Minister has said.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me. I think for me, the controversial statements by the Minister raises alarm in many ways, because unfortunately, in a country, of course, which is dealing with a lot of teenage pregnancies, you cannot attribute that to social media or even the internet to start with. There's no relationship between the two. Of course, maybe it's just an excuse that they are using to justify the need to regulate social media. So for me, that raises alarm, and also it's got a chilling effect in terms of freedom of expression and also internet freedom in general.
Okay. I think that's probably much the consensus. John, anything you'd like to add? Because it seems really strange that he'd used that example. You'd think they might have come up with hate speech or disinformation, but to talk about teen pregnancies. Your thoughts?
My immediate thought was like, this is a smokescreen to regulate what they always wanted to do, because we know that the SWAPO chief who were already last year or the year before already mentioned the concern about regulating the internet and especially the social media. And so this might just be a smokescreen using teenage pregnancy so as to do what they always wanted to do. Because if it's really about teenage pregnancy, we've got laws. For example, I'm thinking about there is the Combating of Immoral Practices Act that says, for example, any person that is that conduct a sexual act with a child between the ages of, say, 14 and 16 commit statutory rape. So there are legal provisions that can be used to address the issue of teenage pregnancy and not do what this. Actually, there was this very nice, sorry to take so long. No. Yesterday there was a very nice, appropriate editorial in the Namibian Sun. It's like making the analogy of throwing a baby away with the bathwater. It's like the internet is a good thing. Of course, it comes with all its ills and whatever the case may be. But let's address the issues that must be addressed and not use some disproportionate measures to try and address a problem that can be addressed in any other manner.
Exactly.
That would be my point.
I'd also wondered at the time the Minister made this statement, which was at a press conference, why none of the journalists present didn't ask him the question, how or are you making this, give us examples of where this might have happened and how it might have happened. Yes, yeah. But I think, John, a very good point that there are existing laws that adequately deal with so many of these things, which is why these threats of regulation seem so gratuitous in many ways. Let's maybe also turn to our police chief, Sebastian Daitunga. who also recently lambasted the youth, radical youth, I think he called them, and basically said that he will not tolerate what he called the insult against political leadership by the youth. And again, this leads into the threats made by the minister, so it creates a bit of an ominous environment.
There I would advise that the police chief and all those in authority should make it a point to read General Comment number 34, which has been issued by the Human Rights Commission of the UN. And if you allow me, I'll read from this. It says, General Comment number 34. It says, the mere fact that form of expression are considered to be insulting to a public figure is not sufficient to justify the imposition of penalty. It goes further, all public figures, including those exercising their highest political authority, such as a head of state and government, are legitimately subject to criticism and political opinion. So the statement by the police chief and whatever is totally inconsistent with international human rights law. It's fair game. It's like you occupy this position. It comes with the territory.
Exactly. So elected officials really should grow thicker skins in some ways. Admire, any thoughts from you on that?
Yes, certainly I would say they should be able to grow thicker skins, but also I would say that this idea of trying to bring the issue of respect, which is pretty much steeped in African culture, and bring it in a democracy, raises a lot of challenges for us, because at the end of the day we increasingly push for this patriarchal view of things, which really doesn't augur well again with the society that we want to build. So I think the issue that has been raised really about teen pregnancy that we've just been talking about, and now they're talking about respect for elders or respect for political. These are all flimsy excuses, essentially about a desire to rein in on people on social media, which is unfortunate, but we have seen it in other countries that flimsy excuses are always used to justify disproportionate mechanisms by the state.
Exactly. And it often has the reverse effect, doesn't it? I mean, you saw immediately once these statements and comments had been made that the internet or social media goes crazy with the youth then really hitting back. And as John mentioned earlier, again, political criticism of our leadership should be accepted by all. It should be happening in a democracy. In actual fact, they should be held to account. But where that critique may go beyond fair and reasonable criticism into defamation or anything, then we have the laws to deal with it, right?
And to that, I would say, again, international law is very clear. It's like in terms of I think it's Article 19, Paragraph 3 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It lays down a three-step criteria in terms of whenever, of course, no right, including the right to freedom of expression, is absolute. But in terms of international human rights law, there are three criteria, for example, that whatever restriction is planned, whatever, will have to comply with. One, for example, it must be done by way of law of general application. It must serve a legitimate purpose. For example, public order, morals, and all those kind of things. And also the third one is that the question of necessity and proportionality. So that, and very nicely, our constitution say that whenever a right is limited, it should not negate the essential content of the right. So we wait for the parliament, the minister in this case, to come up and say, okay, this is how we want to restrict it, and we will evaluate it against this international standards and norms in terms of specifically paragraph 3 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights.
Exactly. And John, while we're on the subject, just to mention, as our listeners would know, you are also the media ombudsman. Now, our code of ethics for media also includes online media. So obviously you would, when it comes to media committing these contraventions, if you like, for want of a better word, online, then you would have jurisdiction over those. So that would cover that.
I can even give a practical example.
Certainly.
It's like last year I dealt with a complaint that was submitted by a Dutch official,
Okay.
a Dutch person, a person from Holland. The informante, which coincidentally is not a member of the informante, that is not a member of the EFN, published a few years ago a story that is totally wrong, that this person is sought by Interpol and whatever. We engaged and whatever, and they were kind enough to agree that the publication was wrong, and they agreed, and they actually took off this posting on their website. So we do engage as part of self-regulation.
Excellent. And that, again, applies only to the media and through those who are members of, as you say, the Editors Forum of Namibia. One of the things is that obviously regulation, it's a bit of a scary word to me personally, but it's certainly happening around the world, and not only in Africa, but further afield, where various governments are looking at ways and means of how to regulate particularly social media, especially when it comes to what is called disinformation, but also acts of terror and so on. So there are a lot of governments looking at this. And in Africa, we also have the example of Uganda and other countries which are now charging a fee, for example, for bloggers online. And that, again, has a chilling effect where they're actually putting a financial demand to a presence on the internet, and even considering things like charging people for being on social media or taking WhatsApp calls. So there are various ways that people are looking at to regulate. For me, as I said before, it is a scary word, but what do you think about some of these efforts? Is this a direction we should be taking? I mean, some people may say, well, look, it's fine. I was a bit, can I say, taken aback by a recent Afrobarometer survey, which has only just been released, which claimed that nearly 50% or over 50% of Namibians are in fact in favor of regulation of social media, a fact I found very hard to believe. What are your thoughts around this regulation that's happening in other parts of the world? And that's what our minister may say, well, there's nothing wrong, other governments are doing it.
I think the issue of saying regulation, whenever it's mentioned, it always has got this negative connotation that comes with it. Obviously, we should be very wary about using it. But I would say that if you look at what has happened, for example, in Uganda, Tanzania, where you've talked about, where you put a financial burden on people so that they can not be able to access social media or internet, I think that has been happening quite often. For example, if you look at what happens in DRC, internet is very expensive. It's not just because they can't make it cheaper, but I think it's a strategy that the government has decided is going to work for them, so that people cannot go online and then critique or even speak truth to power. So already these financial mechanisms where you make sure that it's very expensive, we've seen that happen in Africa as a way of regulating the social media and also the internet. But we've also seen internet shutdowns, which is also another form, again, of also regulating when, for example, during elections or during a strike or, a protest where you see government literally ordering all telecommunication operators to close down the internet, or even temporarily close down the internet or social media. So I don't really understand the option that the minister wants to take for Namibia. Whether they want to do these periodic internet shutdowns, or they want to have a financial burden on citizens, or they want to actually have intermediary, what they would call intermediary liability on telecommunication operators, to say, when we tell you to do this, you must do that. You must comply. If you don't comply, then your license is really, up for grabs. So it still is right now to understand really how the minister wants to go about doing this. But however they want to do it, I don't think that's the route that the country needs to take. If we still want to be considered a country that promotes democracy and also freedom of expression, that's not the route to take. I think once we take that, it's the wrong turn for me.
Exactly. And let's not forget that we are still number one in the Reporters Sans Frontières rankings in terms of freedom of speech and media freedoms, most particularly. But I think it's fair also to say that the minister, when he held that press conference, did say that the intention was not to restrict free speech. But again, one would guess it's simply to curb what he claims is malicious content. I recently saw an example of a young woman online who really tweeted, she put a video out of a very tribalistic a statement, which finally she was in the uniform at the place in which she worked, and she lost her job. So in some ways I want to say that sometimes the internet or the social media, there's a natural attrition on those kind of people who go way out of the bounds and really say gratuitous things. But again, the minister doesn't intend to restrict free speech, but that's obviously what would happen. Yes. Because how do you go after malicious content and incitement to teen pregnancy? As I say, nobody's proved their case on that without eroding free speech and putting a chill effect on that. Most recently also, you will have noticed that several ministers went online when the fish rot scandal, corruption scandal erupted, to say they condemned corruption and those responsible. And the president really took issue with them very strongly in terms of this. So I think that again has created a bit of a fear on the part of our leadership and our ministries and everybody else who should be out there online pursuing their mandate, and in the case of Ministry of Child Welfare, actually trying to promote or to encourage children, especially the girl child, not to get involved in sexual relationships. So as I say, but unfortunately they all hold back then. And so that's another, if I think of it, a threat almost to free speech online. Any thoughts around that, John?
I certainly agree. And you remind me of the kind of things that the Special Rapporteur for the African Commission on Freedom of Expression last year when he visited the country, absolutely, on invitation on yourselves and Zoe and all the other people, he stressed the notion of self-censorship. It's like in whatever field, it's like freedom of expression is broad enough to embrace opinions that are even seen as
offensive.
Offensive, that's exactly the word that I wanted to use.
Yeah.
Or descending with the majority view. It's like the scope of that is so big. And so for me, the president's reaction to that is really a sad one. It's like a sad president, and it makes people to go into their cocoons and suffering from self-censorship. And I think from the highest office, I mean the person occupying the highest office in this country, that was really a very bad example that he set.
Exactly.
So I certainly don't agree with the kind of statement that the president made in that case.
Yeah.
Just regulate without impinging on freedom of expression is just a non-starter to start with, because how do you do that? How do you fight, or let's say, how do you fight misinformation or disinformation through regulating social media and still assume that you can have a thriving public sphere where people can actually are free to express themselves? I don't think that's possible.
Exactly, and it's going to turn into obviously a lot of monitoring and surveillance, which is again going to create a chill effect. And my question is also, who's going to do this monitoring and this regulating? I mean, our police force, for example, have enough on their hands currently dealing with crime and GBV and all these things in the real world, and really shouldn't be spending their time online going after spurious. That having been said, there is concern about Namibians and their online presence, and many of them are, can one say, going beyond the bounds in various ways. Whether it concerns, there is a lot of fake news going about, there is a lot of disinformation. There is tribalism happening. There are all these things happening. There are young, vulnerable girls on the internet, although I wanted to mention, to admire, there's a 13-year limit to those who can go on Facebook, apparently. I'm not sure how that is monitored, but that those people that the minister refers to as girl child shouldn't really be on the internet, or should they? So again, how do we combat the evils that are happening online, because they are happening, and if we agree that doesn't happen through government regulation, then how are we going to deal with that as ordinary citizens?
In fact, international human rights law provides for prohibited expressions, And there are four, for example. Child pornography is totally illegal. Incitement to commit genocide is totally illegal. Advocacy for national, racial, and religious hatred that constitute incitement to discriminate, hostility, or even violence is prohibited under international human rights law, and an incitement of terrorism. But we should not confuse those things that are clearly prohibited with those ones that falls within the bounds of freedom of expression. And for that reason, I also would want the minister to refer specifically, and the Namibian government, to a resolution that was taken in October 2009 by the UN Human Rights Council. And it, for example, paragraph 5P1 of that says what we are saying. It lists a whole range of things that are considered as impermissible restrictions. For example, criticizing politicians fall within those ones. The so-called insulting politicians falls within those things that are regarded as impermissible restrictions. So I would advise them to refer to that resolution that was taken by the Human Rights Council in 2009 October.
Exactly, and as you say, where those are contravened, existing laws are there to take action. So it would seem a waste of time on the part of Cabinet. And Maya, just to turn to our big 3, 4, your Facebooks, your Twitters, your Googles, and so on. I mean, we don't want to let them off the hook, right?
Sure.
They're making a huge amount of money out of all this social media, and I've recently seen a paper where Facebook is talking about charting the way forward to content regulation, and the quote there that caught my eye was, "The development of regulatory mechanisms should involve not just lawmakers, private companies and civil society, but also those who use online platforms." Now, there seems to be a move globally to look at that kind of regulation in terms of content. How do we, how do we bring that to terms with our government's attempts to regulate social media? Where's the happy medium here?
I think what has been happening ever since the Facebook scandal, which of course we know, the Cambridge Analytica and all these other issues that are related to it, we've realized that, all of a sudden, these platform companies have realized that for them to remain, pushing for self-regulation, it's really becoming very difficult. Especially in Europe, where they have come up with the regulations around, data protection, especially, it has become very difficult. But one thing that I've also seen, especially happening with Facebook, is that they have started they are creating what they call an oversight body made up of, people that are not even involved in the day-to-day running of Facebook, so that they can moderate content and help them in terms of how do we talk about permissible and impermissible forms of speech online, that is. These are all ways to try and say, how can we make sure that the platform remain very healthy, but at the same time, as you have already pointed out, the issue of saying, how do we know that a 13-year-old girl or boy is the one who is actually, logging in or logging out? It's very difficult. It's very difficult because I can always fake the number of hits that I have because I have access to the internet. As long as I have the access to the internet, I can always open as many accounts as I want. And even this issue to say you use your real name on Facebook, we've seen that doesn't work. People actually use all kinds of parody names, pseudonyms and all these other things on Facebook, and they go out, saying all kinds of malicious things against politicians and even individuals. There's a lot of, cyberbullying that goes on. We don't really have to run away from that. Exactly. But my argument is that what we see online is just a mirror of what happens offline. So ultimately, we should deal with what these issues offline first, so that when we go online, we can be able to do, just like teen pregnancy. You cannot deal with teen pregnancies online, but you can't deal with it offline. Exactly. It doesn't make sense.
And sometimes, social media or the internet is a mirror of our own societies, isn't it? Yes. And, I think everybody agrees that generally we're going through a phase where we are morally pretty bankrupt, and those things need to be dealt with in the real world. But at the same time, the Facebooks, the Googles, have a certain responsibility,
Sure,
right?
sure,
in terms of actually taking down content that violates those points that John has just mentioned. But then people will say, well, where do we stand here? We don't want government to regulate, but at the same time, do we really want these huge commercial entities to regulate us as well?
Just to chip in there,
Sure.
again, the other issue that comes in, how do we expect a platform that has got over 2 billion to be able to monitor almost like I don't know how many tons of content that they deal with. Obviously now that's why they are they're actually outsourcing this to algorithms, they're outsourcing it to artificial intelligence and all these things, because they just can't do it. The manpower to do that is just, and you cannot even be able to deal with. So I think there should be mechanisms of how do we do that online, so that we can be able to have a healthy public sphere online. That's what I would.
Maybe just as we start to conclude, John, just to say, I think we're getting somewhere with this, and that is to agree that when it comes to criminal acts, as have been defined by what John has mentioned, we should act.
Exactly.
Whether it's us as individuals taking issue, whether it is the Googles and the Facebooks, whether it is anybody in government who feels offended, let's act and let's get that sort of content off. For the rest, let it flow. Let the internet remain free, remain accessible, because after all, that was the whole point of it, right? Back when the internet started, we all thought, wow, this is going to be really such a boost for democracy. Now people who've never had a voice before have got a voice online. And then perhaps just to come to the conclusion and wrap up, if we all say, and it seems the three of us are certainly in agreement about regulation and certainly no to government regulation, what do we do to really enhance people's presence on the internet? There's no doubt, and I know I'm on Twitter, I'm not on Facebook, but there are times when people come after me so gratuitously that I'm very tempted to close my account. What do we do about the bullying and the disinformation and everything? How do we educate people going forward? John, can I get final thoughts from you and then Admire?
Yeah. Mine is to stress the idea of digital literacy. Starting from a very young age, that young children must be made aware and empowered in terms of the safety and not exposing personal information on the internet. So for me, the question of digital literacy is very, very important. That would be the way to go, instead of going way overboard in trying to address the problem with which we are serving. So because the benefit of the internet
should outweigh the negatives.
Exactly, very much so. But also government is having the responsibility. People should be made aware of the responsibility to contribute positive information towards the internet. As I said already, you've spoke about the notion of empowering, especially marginalized groups. Absolutely. The internet can be used tremendously to empower marginalized groups like people with disabilities. Our marginalized groups such as the Ovahimba and the Sun and whatever, these people must be educated, given education. So how can we use the internet so as to empower ourselves and So those are the kind of things that we must begin to interrogate, and not see how can we, what mechanisms can we make to encroach on the rights of the people.
In other words, more access, not less access. And
exactly, that is.
What about, Admire, maybe let me turn to you, kids and smartphones. Do parents have a role in this? I mean, imagine, John, you would be pointing at schools as logical places to do a lot of this digital literacy. What about the home, the families, the parents who are giving their kids smartphones at very young ages, and they're getting onto probably some fairly horrible sites when they do so? What do you think about that?
I think again the parents, they have got a role to play in terms of educating their kids on digital literacy programs. For example, you just don't give somebody a right without also expecting the responsibility. So I think the responsibility part is the one that is really lacking in the home, and I think we need to emphasize more on that. But the other issue that I wanted to say is that especially platform companies, they have a responsibility to make sure that those community reporting mechanisms that they have are actually, being used accordingly, so that when somebody bullies me, I can be able to report or, flag or even block or even flag them and say this person actually is not good to be on this space. Or what can you do to block them or to maybe suspend them? I think those mechanisms should actually be made to work for the good of society. Otherwise, those community reporting standards therefore don't make sense for us.
And also for the youth really to have that knowledge that they are what they are online. I think there are a lot of people, especially with anonymous accounts, who think, okay, I can say what I like, and in real life I work at X place, but they should know that there are very real consequences for what they say or do. And I think the example is the one I mentioned earlier of this one young woman who's lost her job. And now everybody knows about her, and she's going to be hard to employ because she's made these gratuitously tribalistic statements. So I think it will come down to what the individual user does. Also, I think we must take care when we talk about regulation, how different we all are. I mean, in our cultural diversity in Namibia alone, how do you legislate something which may be offensive to me, but is not offensive to you, or vice versa? So I think, is that the way we go? Are we all anti this government attempts to regulate the way they want to? Last word, please, John.
Very, very much so. And internet users must also be educated on that they expose themselves also to defamation charges. It's like it doesn't say you can just say and do things online and whatever. You expose yourself to some serious defamation claims and whatever.
Exactly.
So that needs to be stressed also.
And media literacy, which you've emphasized, very important, particularly when you look at studies that have been done about our last elections and the amount of disinformation that's been, that people have probably swallowed hook, line and sinker. They really, at the end user is the one who should be responsible for checking the type of content they access and they on pass. Admire, any last words from you on the regulation topic?
No to government regulation. And I also want to say, I think for users, I think we need to be very wary in terms of the kind of information that we share online, knowing that nowadays tweets, posts are also admissible in courts of law. So it's very important for you to know, the limits of what you can say online and offline.
Great, and I think finally our two academics and one journalist sitting here today have put our message across, and we hope that the Minister and the Cabinet are listening and that they won't pursue this idea and try instead to really take a more positive road to actually dealing with these problems through creating a more knowledgeable online community. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Gwen.